We're going to finish up Unit 3 with 3.8 Human Population Dynamics and 3.9 Demographic Transition in AP Environmental Science. All right, make sure that you pay attention to our learning goals, our learning targets. All right, so population growth and consumption are two biggest drivers of environmental change. The United States has typically been the biggest consumer of goods and producer of pollutants, but China and other nations are rapidly gaining in both areas. So this comes out of the textbook. You can see I have this diagram here from a place called Statista, and it looks like the United States actually has fallen a little bit in terms of our projected growth. So this is projected growth for from 2020 to 2030, and it looks like the US won't be leading at some point, but as of right now, we still are. All right, let's talk about China's one-child policy. So they were rapidly becoming too big. Billion people, and they're like, we are going to run out of food for our country. So because it's a communist dictatorship, they said, okay, everybody can only have one child. So it's kind of weird, but think about growing up without any cousins, brothers, sisters, aunts, or uncles, because your parents they were from one child families, so they don't have any brothers or sisters, so you have no aunts or uncles, you have no brothers or sisters, you have no cousins. All you have is parents and grandparents. Kind of a strange thing if you think about it. Okay, so the one-child policy financially rewarded families with one child. They posed taxes, wage garnishments. Sometimes they had forced abortions and forced sterilization. Sterilization means that they would surgically cause you to not have children anymore. And so our TFR in China went from 6.3 in 1970 to 1.5 today. And some of them, though, some people say, oh, that was because of economic prosperity. In some places, they didn't enforce it as much, but in the big cities and in most places, they did enforce the one-child policy. They are reversing it because they realize they don't want a shrinking population because of economics. But it's really hard to get people to have more than one child when they grew up with being the only child, and that's just normal. And they're like, well, I mean, we don't need to have more than one child. So it's really hard to reverse that policy once they've had it for so many years. So you guys can pause the video and take a look at the factors that contribute to population growth and decline. So over here we have population growth, all of these. Population decline, all of these. And so on the AP test, you might see a free response question that will ask you about factors that would increase population, factors that would decrease population. And so you will need to know some of these things to be able to write down. All right, we can also talk about urbanization. So more than half of the world lives in urban situations. So an urban situation is a town of 2,500 or more people is considered urban. Less than that is considered rural. We live in the suburbs of Los Angeles, but the suburbs are considered urban. It's like it's a classification of urban, but because our town has more than 2,500 people, it's considered urban. And so this is actually a big shift. I remember when this was reported in the news, not only in the US, but in the world. So it used to be that more people lived in rural places. Now more people live in urban places. And that's going to kind of change how you think about the role of community and government and things like that. Okay, so human population is influenced by our density-dependent factors like air, water pollution, diseases, climate change. We're also impacted by density-independent factors, fires, floods, hurricanes, tsunamis. Those things do kill people, and they can influence our population size. So this is a relation of human population to density-dependent and independent factors. And they influence our health and our rates of births, deaths, etc. Okay, so let's talk about population momentum. So population momentum, and the answer is in red there. So in your study guide, you have a question, what is population momentum? So after a population has reached replacement fertility, 2.1 children per woman on average, that's our TFR, it usually takes about 20 years to have zero population growth, because the youngest generation that was born before we hit the magic number of 2.1 will have their children. So for example, in the US, the baby boomers were born post World War II, 1945 to about 1965. And even though the baby boomers themselves, they started having way less children than before, because there were so many baby boomers all having their 2.1 children, the population still grew in the United States because there were so many people having their 2.1 children on average. And so it's going to influence in the 1920s, when that large generation starts to be in their 20s and 30s and they have their 2.1 children, that's when you see the largest population growth. All right, this is a weird graphic. So this is a graphic on regions of the world with the highest growth and population density. Actually, this is population density. So the number of people per hectare of land, or square kilometer of land. And you can see the United States is pretty skinny. Central America, South America, pretty skinny. And then Africa, China, India, so they're much closer together. So the US, now it may seem crowded, for example, where I live in Los Angeles, if you live in New York, it's going to seem real crowded, but there's a lot of places with hardly any people in the US. You can drive for miles and not see any homes. And so that makes our whole population density really low. Okay, so here's some countries that you have to know about. So which regions have the highest growth rates? Sub-Saharan Africa. You cannot just say Africa, because you have Saharan Africa, parts of the Middle East, not quite, but it's a little overlap there. And they have different demography than sub. Sub means below. So below the Saharan Desert, south of the Saharan Desert, you're going to have different demography. And so sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, so India, Indonesia, places like that, are going to have the highest growth rates. The slowest growth rates, Europe, North America, Japan, China have the slowest growth rates. Now China, because of the one-child policy, Japan, just culturally, they've just stopped wanting to have lots of children, people. North America, same thing. Europe, same thing. Okay, which region of the world has the highest population density? Southeast Asia. So make sure you know those. All right, what are our consequences of human population growth without an increase in fresh water? So water, they expected to run out for people in the world before, let's say, our food supplies run out. There's also big shifts with climate change and drought. There's some places we're kind of really worried about Southeast Asia because the glaciers are melting in the Himalayas, and the glacier melt each spring supplies rivers, and that fresh water is what a couple billion people use for drinking water, to grow their crops. And so if the glaciers melt completely away, then you're not going to have that spring thaw to recharge your rivers. So if humans go over our carrying capacity in a certain region, they're going to have wars for water. A lot of what's happening in places like Syria is a drought, which caused a civil war to begin as people fought over water. Okay, next, let's talk about math. So you have to know the rule of 70 in AP Environmental Science. It's called the doubling time. So basically we take 70 over R. R is our growth rate of a usually country, although we can use R in a town, and we can do math with R, not just in a country, but a city or a town. And it pops out as number of years. And so you can see if your population is growing at 2% a year, you're going to double in 35 years. So you are going to have lots of practice with this on special worksheets. All right, let's talk about the theory of demographic transition, is how a country moves from higher to lower birth rates and death rates as development occurs, and the country moves from pre-industrial to an industrial economic system. Okay, in AP Human Geography, they go to stage 5, which is population decline. In AP Environmental Science, we stop at 4. Why? I don't know, but we do. So you just have to know 4 stages. So stage 1, let's focus in on that. Here is stage 1. So that graphic that was on the previous slide is now just it's given to you here, just stage 1. Okay, so crude birth rate is equal to crude death rate. Both are high. Life expectancy is short. Infant and child mortality is high. Children are needed for the workforce to care for the elderly. Lack of medical care. More accidents. Lack of clean water. So this was basically most of the world pre-industrial revolution, which was in the late 1700s, early 1800s was when that began to change. So before that, this was normal. This is still normal in, well, it's hardly normal anywhere anymore. Maybe in some isolated tribes you might have this, but most countries have now moved into at least the second or third one. So let's look at stage 2. Again, all of these things here you have to know. So you might have a question on your quiz, on your unit exam. In which stage of demographic transition are children more likely to be in the workforce? And you would want to say stage 1. In which stage of the demographic transition model would you have more accidents, lack of medical care? Stage 1. Those kinds of questions. So make sure you know all those things. Okay, make sure you know these things about stage 2. So in stage 2, we have higher birth rates because people have not yet picked up to the fact that the death rates have dropped. So death rates start to drop because we have more food, better technology in our food, more sanitation, sewers, cleanliness. We have clean drinking water, we have vaccinations. So a lot of countries are in this position right here. The World Health Organization brings in medical care to countries. The death rate starts dropping, but it takes a generation to realize you don't have to have as many kids. The United States went through this in early 1900s. My grandparents and great-grandparents were born in the early 1900s. They had lots of children because they did not realize that they didn't need as many children anymore. First of all, a lot of people don't live on farms anymore. And it used to be if you lived on a farm, you needed a lot of children to help run the farm. More agricultural innovation means that you don't need as many farmers. And then death rates drop. Not as many children died. It used to be very common in, let's say, my great-grandparents' time, or even my grandparents' time, and I'm older than you, so for you it might be great-great-grandparents' time, and further back. It was common to have some of your siblings die just from childhood diseases, etc. My mom was born in 1944, and she has 7 siblings. None of them died, but that was so unusual. But that's because penicillin came in. She almost had a sister die from pneumonia, and the country doctor in 1947 said, oh, hey, there's this new medicine that could cure her from pneumonia. Now, some people have an allergic reaction. She could die, but she's going to die tonight from pneumonia anyway. And the parents were like, okay, we'll try it. And it was a miraculous kind of thing, like, oh, penicillin, it really saved her life. So we started having penicillin, which kills bacteria infections. We have vaccines. We have other kinds of medical care. And all of a sudden, the death rate drops. So then my mom and her siblings all had 2.1 children instead of 7 because they realized, oh, we don't have to have lots of children. Children aren't dying anymore. We also don't need them. We don't live on the farms anymore. Okay, death rate drops, birth rate's still high because you're in that 20 years of realizing that that's the case. So stage 3, our population growth begins to slow down and stabilize because less need for children, more income, so you don't need children to work or work the farm for your family's prosperity. Education becomes a priority, so girls stop having as many children, girls and women. And so birth and death rates, they start to equalize here. Okay, stage 4 is where the US is in and many, many developed countries. Technically, we're in stage 5, but we don't do that one in APES, so we're going to say stage 4. So birth and death rates are equal, but they're low. High affluence. Affluence means wealth, economic prosperity, more educated women, lower infant and child mortality, higher rates of family planning, more contraceptive, that's birth control. Families may become an undesired financial burden. So in older times, kids could work and add to the finances of the family. In modern times, we want our kids to have education that costs money. So people are choosing not to have as many children because of the expense of daycare, childcare, soccer, clubs, and education, college. So in the US even, people are like, we can't afford that many children. Women choose to remain in school, and the workforce is no longer in the workforce longer before childbearing, and then after childbearing, they return to the workforce. And there are more older people than younger people in the population. Okay, so let's talk about population and consumption. Consumption is using resources. Okay, so both population size and the amount of resources each person uses are factors to determine the impact of humans on Earth. Crops use energy. Tractors use fossil fuels. It's not just tractors, it's all kinds of farm machinery. We'll talk about that later in Unit 5. Crops use water, minerals for fertilizer. As populations advance, people want meat. So as you get more money, you want more meat. It's just kind of the trend. So crops are then used to feed farm animals, and you lose 90% of that energy as heat. We have our first and second laws of thermodynamics and trophic levels and food webs from Unit 1. Developed nations are 1.3 billion people. Developing is 6.5. So as the developing nations' affluence goes up, their resource use grows up as well. Okay, so these are the 12 most populous countries in the world. China's, actually, India might, this figure might be 2 years old now, and I think India might slightly be higher. You could Google that, which one has more currently. The United States is third, but both India and China have 1 billion more people than the US. Okay, and then we also have this diagram of population growth in specific developing countries, and you can see their population growth in these countries. All right, going on to our last slide for Unit 3. Okay, so we have something called IPAT equation. The impact on the environment is equal to the population times the affluence, the wealth, and the technology. More population, richer you are, the more technology you use, because technology uses resources, the bigger the impact on the environment. All right, that is it for not only this section, but for Unit 3.